So this is intended really to be a bit thought-provoking, maybe tell you a few hints and tips and get you thinking about why you might want to photograph minerals, and if so, what you should do to be going about it. So I guess the first thing really is to quantify and put some constraints around what is mineral photography, and it's really a subset of sort of close-up or tabletop or macro photography. And increasingly now people are going for smaller and smaller fields of views, with vanishingly small depth of field, and we'll come back to that later on. But what I'm going to talk about this evening is principally photographing hand specimens, which I would define as being something, sort of fist size, somewhere in the sort of 2 to 4, 5 inch range. And that's what I'm really geared up to do myself, and I'll explain why in a minute. Some of the key issues are, first of all, lighting and color rendition. And you will all have seen photos of things and you think, well, that's not the right color. That leuroconite doesn't look the right color, blue or green. The malachite or the azurite doesn't look right. And this is a particular problem in our field, because if you know something about the subject matter, you know what color it should be. And so getting the lighting and the color temperature is important. And it's much easier nowadays with digital than it was with film. And I started off doing mineral photography with 35mm slide film, and there it was really important, because otherwise you end up with a very orangey sort of result. The other things that make this an interesting exercise is that minerals tend to be shiny and reflective, and so it's important to try and avoid unwanted reflections. But equally well, if you have no reflections, that may make your subject look rather flat and uninteresting and boring. And then the other thing that people seemingly don't think about, if you look online, and we'll have a look at a few pictures later on, backgrounds. People put their specimens on the most distracting backgrounds. And in fact, in the MINDAT photographic sort of editing and selection world, distracting background is one of the things that quite often means that images are left in user gallery rather than public gallery. And then the other thing is the shape and the size of the crystals. If we've got a crystal which is about, say, 1 inch or 2 inches in dimension, that's relatively straightforward to photograph that. So long as it's got a reasonably sort of distinct outline and you can get the light around it, not a problem. But once you start getting down to millimeter or sub-millimeter crystals, very difficult to make those look interesting. And that's really a whole different subject, which I would suggest might make another interesting talk. And I can suggest people that are expert in that field if Shanice is interested. So there are many reasons why collectors want to take images. Most obviously, you might just want to send a photo to somebody and say, I found this afternoon. I think it's great, or do you know what it is? You might be wanting to record your collection. You might be wanting to put something online, maybe to sell something on eBay, or simply to add it to some sort of platform like Instagram or Facebook. And also, and really the thing that got me into this, is to put images into publications. So for all those reasons, we might want to photograph our specimens. Stating the obvious, it does help to have a good specimen to start with. If you've got just a lump of brick, it's not going to make an exciting photo. And so if I'm buying a specimen nowadays, I tend to look at things with the eye of a photographer. And I would, generally speaking, I would not buy something that wouldn't make a nice image. So we're talking about well-displayed crystals, obviously at a high degree of perfection, ideally, on a matrix with a contrasting background, and something that will sit in a manner that you can actually get a pleasing result. And so, again, perhaps it's obvious, but it's worth stating that if you've got black crystals at the far end of a VUG on a dark matrix, it's always going to be very difficult to make those interesting or produce a satisfactory result. Now, sometimes if you're writing an article about black crystals at the back of a deep cavity on a dark matrix, you've got no choice but to give it a try. And obviously there are things that you can do. But if you're making a start, it's worth starting with something that's going to be sort of compliant and favourable to getting something usable. And so allied to that, using a plain non-distracting background, and typically a pale background or a black background are going to be the things to start with. Quite often you see people put their specimen on a piece of towel, and it's just the worst possible thing that you end up with lots of fluffy loops in and out of focus. and it's very distracting, or people put it on a bright red tablecloth or something like that. Those are simple pitfalls that can be avoided with very little effort. And I would point you to back issues of the Mineralogical Record as being a very interesting lesson in how this particular art form, and I guess, we are talking about an art form in terms of photography, has developed over the past few decades. And if you go back to the very early issues of the Mineralogical Record, the photos were in black and white. And nowadays people would laugh at you if you put a mineral photo up in black and white. So things have moved a long way in my lifetime. And a couple of people I'd like to draw your attention to and also say a thank you to some extent are Jeff Scoville and Wendell Wilson. So Jeff Scoville is probably the person that most people would think of if you know anything at all about mineral photography and mineral publications. Jeff Scoville is pretty much the master. And I met Jeff at Tucson the first time in 2008. And this was his setup. And he had only just switched from 35mm transparency film to digital that year. And you can see in the picture here, and we'll come back to the general setup, that this is his camera on a tripod. So important that you have a stable, shake-free substrate for the camera. He's using a photo flood at the top. He's got electronic flash. He's got a sheet of non-reflective glass, and it's sat on a sort of aluminium speed frame. And there's various ways of doing that. You could knock it up in softwood if you wanted to. It can just be a cardboard box or an old drawer. There's umpteen variants. And then the coloured background, you can see draped to the background there is red and could easily be changed to black or blue or whatever. And so although this looks big and sophisticated and expensive, the fundamental elements are pretty straightforward. And if you're interested in getting into this, even though the book was written in the days of film, I highly recommend Photographing Minerals, Fossils and Lapidary Materials. It was a relatively expensive thing when I bought it. It was about £35 in 1996. You probably get it on Abe Books for a few quid if you hunt around nowadays. But it's got lots of useful advice, which is just as applicable today as it was back then. And then the other guy, who in many ways, I guess, has driven the hobby, is Wendell Wilson, who's still editor-in-chief at the Mineralogical Record. Whether he'll ever retire or die in harness, I don't know. I think that's a bit of an open question. And he was one of the pioneers of shooting on what the Americans called plexiglass. We would call it perspex. It's an acrylic sheet. And if you go to a plastic supplier, generally speaking, people want the transparent variety to use as a glass substitute. But you can get opal perspex, and that makes quite a useful and quite a durable background. And that's where I started, in fact, was using that because there's much less danger of breaking it when you're carting it around. So thank you to these two guys, and we'll probably come back to them later on. And I was looking at something recently, and I came across this, and I thought that would be an interesting add-in slide, so I've just dropped it in. So here we are in 1988. That's an amazing 37 years ago. Here was an article. So we have colour on the cover of Rocks and Minerals and no colour inside. Okay, it was just too difficult and too expensive to use colour. And here we have Jeff Scoville talking about lights and metering. And in these days, you would have to have a separate light meter. It would tell you what f-stop and shutter speed to set your camera to. You would then do that. Generally speaking, you would have to bracket it. So you would go wider aperture and smaller aperture, maybe up or down a stop, and also on the shutter speed. And the hit rate would have been relatively low in terms of producing results. And you can see here, very simple bits of cardboard. These are called helping hands. They're still available these days, the little crocodile clips on a heavy weight. And that's exactly what Jeff uses today, and so do I. So just an indication here that you can go back in time and learn something from the history. Now, of course, people's aspirations now are sky high. It seems that budgets are almost limitless for people in buying high-end mineral specimens. And as a result of that, the dealer world and the photography associated with selling minerals has really gone up, leaps and bounds. And so here we have a fantastic image. This is from Jeff Scoville's website. If you've never looked at it, that's the link at the top. So you can just take a screenshot of that if you want to. And he's got a huge armory of images that he's taken from collections over the decades. But here we have a screw dislocation in the middle of a beryl crystal. And because of the reflection inside the crystal, we're seeing multiple images of it. Now, you might say, well, it'd be much better if I didn't see those, but I'm sure that he lit it so that it would produce that effect. And so there's a certain amount of personal taste and preference in this sort of thing. Here's another couple of Jeff's really striking images. And this is a specimen which he photographed in that book. I'm sure he's redone the image since then. And here we have one of these beautiful bicolored tourmalines. And so one of the things that you may start to think about is, do I want a shadow or don't I want a shadow? Do I want a reflection or don't I want a reflection? And all of these things are adjustable, because photographing minerals is about controlling the light which falls on the specimen and reaches the camera. And so here he's chosen to have total darkness behind the terminations and then a graded background coming forward. And he's chosen to have a shadow. So there's light coming from above to create that shadow. And so it makes it look perhaps more three-dimensional than if it had just been shot on a black background with no light on the background. Here we've got a semi-matte surface and a sort of dull reflection. And so this will have been produced with a polarizing filter, where you can actually get rid of the reflection completely. You'll have a partial or a whole reflection. So these are things that we'll come on to. I thought it would be interesting just to note that there are other people in the game apart from Jeff. And when I was looking at this last week, just to polish it up, this is a slide set that I originally did back in about 2012 for Russell Society, and I've updated it slightly since then. And I was quite surprised to find that Michael Bainbridge no longer exists on the web as a photographer, because he's now the curator at the Canadian Museum of Natural History. So he probably hasn't got time. But this was his sort of business card website back in 2012. And you can see the quality is unquestionable. He's absolutely in the same league as Jeff. And he was, if you like, really putting this forward much more as a business proposition. He's saying, this is what I can do for you. I'm a lifelong collector. I understand your stuff. I know why you'd want to do this. I can do high resolution, high quality imagery. We can have it printed up to 10 by 15 or much bigger if you want to print it on the wall. I'm insured to $2 million and so on. And so you can start to see now that this guy will come to your home for some sum of money, and he will photograph anything that you wanted to photograph, and then he'll go away and process those imaging. But sadly, I don't think Michael's available anymore. He's a really nice guy. I met him at Rochester a few years ago. And as of 2023, he's now full-time assistant curator. So here he is receiving the award at the Tucson show for his services. Coming a bit closer to home, I don't know whether any of you met Mick Cooper. I think Alan Barnes probably will have done. Mick sadly died a few years ago, very unexpectedly and tragically. But he was probably, at the time, most people would have thought as being the expert in mineral photography. And Mick did a lot of the photography for Richard Bevin's Mineralogy of Wales. So if you've got a copy of that, many of the images in that were done by Mick. And he also did all the imagery for the book on Langban. I forgot the name of the author, but as a result of that, he became, sort of well known. He knew John White, and you'll see that the picture at the top was taken by John White, who was the original editor of the Minaret. And for many years, he was an associate editor and photographer for the Minaret, and so he would cover things like the Sainte Marie show, Munich show, and so on. And he then went on to produce his own book, Minerals of the English Lake District, Corbett Fells, with Chris Stanley from the NHM. So all of that work was done pre-digital. He favoured Fuji slide film, and that meant you had to send it off by post. You would wait for your 36 exposures to come back and see whether you'd got any usable ones, and then you'd blow another 10 quid on another roll of film and send it off and see if you could get a better result. And Mick was, really quite a pioneer in this field. And of course, when you're doing this for real with slide film, you don't know whether you've got any good results. You've just spent all day at the National Museum of Wales, maybe taken 10 rolls of film, and you don't know whether that's actually going to produce any usable imagery. And he was able, with extension tubes and bellows, to go down to quite small fields of view. And this is actually a micromount of mine on the cover of issue number 3 of the UK Journal. And it's only a 1.5 millimeter long crystal, so that's quite impressive. But of course, you don't get the depth of field. And nowadays, people use stacking technology, and you get infinite depth of field. And sometimes I think they look a little bit unreal, as you'll perhaps see on the next one. So the next name that would spring to mind in my mind certainly was David Green, who was again the prime mover behind the UK Journal and took over from Mick as editor. And he became probably our foremost mineral photographer, and you'll find his work in all the back issues of the UK Journal, Mines and Minerals, the Journal of the Russell Society. And he too started off in slides and then progressed to digital. And the big advantage, other than the fact that you get some sort of instant result, is cost, obviously. Effectively, memory cards are free fill. But this is a stacked image, and you can see that you've got improbably good depth of field here. And you could have had the whole background sharply in focus if you wanted to. And we'll perhaps come back to that later on. We'll see how the time goes. So that's sort of setting the scene. So the challenge of getting these very small images is seemingly now a very, very high profile activity for people. And if you combine digital photography, image processing, the fact that people have now got powerful PCs, it opens up a whole new world. And you can use a simple piece of stacking software and produce really amazing results. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I can make some suggestions perhaps for someone who'd like to come and talk on that. But to go back to what I said at the beginning, I'm going to really talk about hand specimens. And this is essentially what I would see as the minimum requirement. Ideally, you should have an SLR. You can obviously use a bridge camera. I guess you could use a mobile phone if you wanted to, but you'll get much better results with a proper camera and a macro lens. Macro lens is probably going to cost you at least as much as the camera body. So my macro lens, as I bought, it was about £600, I think. Circular polarizing filter. I mentioned in passing that the reason for that is to be able to control or remove reflections either on the specimen or on the background. I use electronic flash, and there's two principal reasons for that. One is you get color accurate daylight color temperature, and secondly, the speed of the flash essentially removes any camera shake at all, and so you're going to get a good shot. And then you connect the camera to the electronic flash unit with the TTL flash lead. And yes, this stuff does cost a bit of money, but this will last a long time. The flash lead will last forever. And realistically, you'll get an awful lot of life out of a digital SLR. I'm still using the body that I had when I did Crystal Mountains in 2012. And then to diffuse the flash, because you get a very intense spot coming from the flash tube, you want to have some sort of soft box. I've pasted in here a picture of the sort of thing you can just buy online. It's essentially a lampshade with a piece of tissue paper across the front. And I just made one out of cardboard, and I did that. You'll see that in the next slide. I did it back in 2012, and I'm still using it. It works. There's no real need to spend a lot of money on that sort of stuff. And then the substrate on which we're going to place the specimen, either glass or acrylic, or it could be a piece of velvet or matte black painted wood or whatever you want to do. But there are benefits and reasons to using glass in particular, which I'll move on to in a minute. And then I have a sort of toolbox of wine corks and little wedges made of wood, bits of blue tack, the mineral stands that you see with the L-shaped mineral stands, little bits of perspex and so on. Because if you're out shooting on location, which is generally where I do my photography, you never know what you're going to encounter. And all of this stuff fits into a big black suitcase on wheels, and I trundle that into London from working at NHM. I can be up and running in about 15 minutes or so. So this is my typical setup, and do laugh if you feel like it. Alan Hart came across to me one day, some of you may remember Alan at NHM, and said to me, baked bean tin photography. Well, yeah, they're actually tomato tins, but there are 4 tins. They make a very nice solid support. It gives you enough clearance under the glass to be able to slide a different coloured sheet underneath it, and they're indestructible and cheap. Little cardboard reflectors here. You see here's a helping hand. Sometimes I put that up there as well. My 2 side supports are box files. They just happen to be what I had around at the time. 2 pieces of aluminium rack shelving wall bracket. Again, they were just knocking around in the garage and I needed something to support the top. And because the box files are hollow, other stuff can go inside them, so that all helps to densify the kit in terms of packing it and lugging it around. You can see the lead here. There's the camera. The flash gun is sat in the top of this cardboard pyramid, which I really must replace one of these days. It's a little bit heavy to hold, but it does the job and it served me very well. And so the idea is that the camera is looking at that line of sight. So it will see the specimen and it will see whatever's behind the specimen here. And so if we've got a white surface under here, it will tend to look grey, and that's fine. Grey is a good colour for a mineral background. And because we've got a roof on the setup here, this flash gun is going to send light down there. And so there will be a graded effect like you get around the sun, the umbra and penumbra. And so you'll get total darkness at some distance back here, and then gradually it'll become lighter and brighter. And forward of about here, it'll be fully illuminated. And by swinging the illumination round in an arc, you can create quite a range of different effects. And so generally speaking, if I was doing a project, I'd probably take 3 or 4 shots with the flash in different positions, and I'd probably do it on 2 or 3 backgrounds. Generally, I would do it on white, black, and maybe on a color if I thought there was some good reason for doing it. The stuff in the bottle here is glass cleaner. You know, the basic stuff really does make a difference. When I arrive somewhere, I've got a bit of lint-free cloth, and I clean the glass and make sure that I get as many fingerprints off it as possible. Because although you can fix these things later in Photoshop or whatever, it's much quicker and better to do it right the first time. And the same applies to dust and cleaning the specimen, which I'll try and remember to mention again later. So here we are looking at our sheet of glass. In this shot, I introduced a little modeling light. So this is just an IKEA LED light, because sometimes in an area of very poor illumination, so if I'm working in a museum store, the light level may be very low. It's sometimes quite difficult to get the camera to focus, and it can be helpful just to swing a light in so that you get good illumination. I tend to use autofocus. It works very well. Sometimes it won't, and you just have to switch over to manual. But most of the time, if you illuminate the specimen appropriately, autofocus works fine. And I'll be looking at this point before I start taking shots, excuse me, for any little crumbs that have fallen off the specimen. So it's a good idea to sweep the glass between every shot, to look for dust and fluff. It's amazing how it's possible to miss dust and fluff, particularly for someone like me where close vision is starting to go. And then you move the card reflectors closer so they're out of the field of view, but positioned so that they illuminate the specimen as you wish. And then here's our black lid at the top. So yeah, I think I've probably covered all of that. So now we're ready to take the shot. And you can see I brought the reflectors in quite close and tight. I'm satisfied with myself that they're out of the field of view. I know roughly where I want that to be. I'm generally working about maybe 1.5 to 2 inches from the front of the glass. And I will then take a series of shots with slightly different lighting effects. And then the other thing, which I mustn't forget to mention, is the polarizer. This is called a rotary polarizer, and it's like any other filter, like a UV filter, except that it's mounted in a bezel, and so you can rotate it 360 degrees. And there's a little white dot on it, and typically the white dot wants to be at the top of the lens. And then as you rotate it one way or the other way, you will see that the illumination effect changes, and you will either get more of a shadow or less of a shadow or no shadow. And that can be used to kill reflections on the glass, or indeed to kill reflections on the specimen if you want to. So here we have a specimen which is calcite and analcime from Croft Quarry, and the next shot shows you what the camera saw. So you can see here what I was talking about before. Back here there's no light from the flash gun hitting the surface, and it's getting gradually lighter as we come forwards. There's a little bit of specular reflection here. I'm happy with that. That one's perhaps a little bit bright. Ideally you don't want anything that's totally shiny, and or perhaps totally underlit as well. This is perhaps, if I'm being very critical, a little underexposed, and so sometimes at the front here, out of shot, I would put a piece of cooking foil. Aluminium foil as a reflector. It's very malleable, and you can change the shape of it, and you can bring that in so it's out of shot and brighten that up quite satisfactorily. And I've done that quite routinely on many occasions. Here's another shot. So up the top left, this is what we've set up in terms of the specimen on the glass. So this is a specimen of fluorite from, excuse me, Derbyshire. And this is what the camera saw. And again, you can see total blackness at the background and adequate illumination here. And I've left just a little bit of reflection here. I don't know if that you can see that, but you can see there's a bit of lightness there. And so that's somewhat like one of the shots that I showed. And it's not right or wrong. It's just personal preference. And then the next shot is going to show you exactly the same setup. So the specimen hasn't moved. And all I've done is I've slid a bit of blue card underneath the glass. And I've adjusted the reflection to make the reflection a little bit more dramatic. And yeah, some people will say they like the reflection. Some people will say they'd rather not have the reflection. It's absolutely straightforward to get one or the other. And then the other thing that I tend to do is I would use a piece of black velvet for my black background. So just a piece of ordinary sort of upholstery velvet or curtain velvet, something like that. I've got a piece which is about 1 meter by 1/2 meter. Just fold it in half a couple of times, and that can be slid in under there as well. And you're talking about 10 seconds perhaps to change the background color. So it's very worthwhile to do that and then see what works when you get back to the next stage. And so here we are. Here's the black velvet, and exactly the same setup, same lighting. And this is actually what you can see on the screen of the camera. And something that I've learned over the years, and again, probably more applicable to people with grey hair than younger viewers, is that I use one of these headband magnifiers. I don't know if I hold this up to the camera, so people are familiar with that. So this is one, you just pop it on here. And so that gives you a ×10 magnification on what the camera screen is displaying. That gives you a really good chance of seeing the bit of fluff that you can't see without. And again, it's really annoying if there's a bit of fluff on the glass and you've taken 5 specimens and that's 5 times you've got to get that bit of fluff off. So I would recommend that to you, certainly if close vision is a bit of an issue. So here's another example to demonstrate the issue of what you actually see through the camera. So the under color here is a piece of white artboard. But you can see what the camera sees is it's actually grey, and that works really well. If you want that to look white, you need to incline it and bring it much closer to the undersurface of the glass. But generally white doesn't make a good background for minerals. And so I'm very happy with that grey effect. And sometimes, and this is really there to show you, if you don't get the lighting and the angle exactly where you want it, you will get a bit of texture on the glass. Now, I don't particularly object to that, but if you didn't want it to be there, it's worth being aware of that fact. And it's all about the Bragg angle and where that lens is looking in terms of the reflected and refracted light coming through the glass. And so again, we can swap that same specimen with the blue background, and you can see I've played around with the reflectors, moved them around a bit. Or we could drop it onto a red background. And so then you start to open up the possibilities of saying, well, is it beneficial to change the color of the background? And so, for example, a yellow calcite crystal looks really nice on a blue background. And this is to do with color wheels and complementary colors. So it is worth thinking about, but I also think that sometimes different colors can be a bit distracting. So I would say keep it to just a small number unless there's some particular reason for doing it. So I mentioned that most of my photography is done out on location. I just thought I'd illustrate what that looks like. Unless it's somewhere you've been before, you don't know what you're going to encounter. You probably won't know whether the natives are friendly and helpful. And so from memory here, we've got, this is the Royal Cornwall Museum in Truro. This is the Potteries Museum in Stoke-on-Trent. This is National Museum Scotland, the Granton store, which is an absolutely fantastic facility, a great place to work. But occasionally I've had to work on a windowsill, because there was nowhere else to work in the store at the University of Aberdeen, or you find you've only got a couple of square feet of tabletop and you really do need some space. So you can see here, ideally, I want to be able to put the flash gun and the softbox down in between shots. I want room to be able to walk around the tripod because it's really annoying to kick the tripod when you've just got the shot set up and then find that it's moved. And you also need an area to put down a notepad or a clipboard to make notes. Something that I would encourage you to do is to develop a process so that you've got a workflow. If you're doing a project like the Russell Book project, where you're going to be photographing hundreds of specimens and you don't know which ones you're going to use at the outset, it's very important to make sure that when you've taken that photo, you know that it was BM 55272 and you measure it at the time and you record all the details that you've got. And so generally, I record all of that on a pre-printed A4 sheet and I keep those as my master file. And then the other thing that I tend to do is to photograph the specimen with any labels that are with it on just do that on my phone or on a compact camera. And then those two things marry up together. They're obviously taken on the same date and time. It's very easy to say, well, I was at the NHM on the 11th of January 2021, and therefore the label picture will be in that folder too, 11th of January 2021. So that's the sort of places that I'm well used to working. Now, sometimes you meet the extraordinary, and this is a specimen that I encountered in the Ludlow Museum store in Shropshire when I was working on the Midlands book. And it's the largest piece of lilac calcite from the Shropshire mines I think probably exists and has survived anywhere. This is my normal scale bar, which is 5 centimeters. So this thing is well over a meter. It's far too heavy to move, and they wouldn't want me to move it anyway. And it's sat with this delightful Cambrian seafloor mural behind it on a piece of blue formica. And I looked at that in despair, basically, and thought, well, I'd really like to include that image, but it's going to take some doing. And so, necessity is the mother of invention, as it said. So all that I had with me was all my bits of black cardboard, and I thought, well, at least if I can create a fairly sharp boundary along that back bit, I'm pretty happy that I've got a dark shadow around the front of that. I stand some chance of doing a cutout on that. And so I had to go. I focused on trying to make sure the thing was sharp and lit satisfactorily. I wanted to get a little bit of reflection to show that it wasn't just dead. And so that's the finished result that we finished up with, which I was pretty pleased with. But sometimes you're going to hit something that you can't overcome. And here's another one where sometimes you think, well, simple is best. This is obviously galena in calcite from the Peak District with this sort of rhythmic deposition. It is really a black and white mineral. And I thought in that case, I will photograph it on a black background. It doesn't matter that it's flat because it's a flat surface. So that sort of introduces where we're going and what I've been up to. And so typically I would record this information on my sheet, and ultimately I would update the file name. And again, it's a discipline that you really need to get into and do it soon after you've done the job. So here's my file number that's generated by the camera. And I would then change the file name to say Gleaner and Calcite, Castle, Derbyshire, Patrick Dodgen specimen, National Museums of Scotland, accession number and dimensions. And then that's locked in. If you want to go that far, you can put that in the metadata. I've never bothered to do that. There's all sorts of layers of sophistication you can do now with digital file naming, but that's good enough for what I needed to achieve. So I thought now we'd have a bit of a look at some sample images, and you can look at these maybe bearing in mind what I've already said. So I found all of these online recently, like in the last week, and I thought, well, if you were going to photograph that pink pedal with the view to putting it up on Mindat to say, what is it? Or why did you put it on a crisp packet or whatever? The wood would have been better, or, just a piece of plain cardboard. Do we really need to see the Velux window in the background and this person's thumb? I mean, you might argue there's a scale bar aspect of the thumb. A really scratchy blue worktop. And this is just dreadfully lit. And we've got two backgrounds. I think these are the guy's jeans. He's probably sat it on his knee, and a tabletop in the background. So if I was the judge in the competition, I would say could do better to all of those. And if you go and have a look at the stuff that's on Collectors of British Minerals and so on, generally speaking, the photos are pretty dreadful. And I don't understand why people can't be bothered to try a little bit harder. At the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have the real experts. And so increasingly, if you look at something like Rocks and Minerals or the Mineralogical Record, the photography is really about selling the specimen. And so, people will be looking at this and saying, wow, that's just fantastic. And then they'll want to contact whoever put that specimen up and say, is that for sale? How much do you want for that? But you can see here many of the traits that I've mentioned. So graded background, dark black through to sort of slightly illuminated, choice of a shadow or choice of no shadow, a reflection, fairly sharp reflection there. Here we've got no reflection. Here we've gone for a coloured background with a bit of reflection. So it's really whatever works and whatever pleases you. What I personally don't like is these blobs of putty underneath the specimen. I mean, it wouldn't have taken a lot of effort to have moved that putty back out of sight so that this is anhydrite, I think, was sat on the substrate. It's just lack of attention to detail, really. And here's a couple out of the latest MinRec, and this is really taking mineral art to new levels, isn't it? This is a Tom Spann photo. This is an advert for Crystal Classics. I mean, it's a killer specimen, but it's a really nice photo too. And it's clearly been shot with a view to being laid out like that, portrait manner, so that this little inset bit can go in the mitered corner. Top marks, really, really fantastic specimen. And then here, I was quite surprised to see this. This is a British specimen from Frizington, ferruginous quartz, Eisenkiesel on hematite with Rudolph minerals. And it's not the sort of thing that Rudolph minerals generally tend to sell. I dread to think how much it will be, but that's another subject. Now, another good thing to do in terms of self-tuition is simply to go and have a look at other people's photos. And a great place for nice photos is the MIM Museum in Beirut. And they have quite an extensive photo library now. And you can have a look at these and think about, okay, how was that lit? Where was it sitting? So you can see there's a bit of a reflection on that one. Here we've got a halo. And so there's been another light introduced to give us some downlight on that. This one is just floating on black, it's the rockinite. I think that's probably a smithsonite from Sumet. So all sorts of different horses for courses. So I thought maybe to sort of move on, I would show you a sort of a library of things that I photographed, and I'll comment on why I did it or how I did it, and it will perhaps be helpful. So this is a rather nice barite from Shropshire. This is from Arthur Russell's collection. It's a terribly fragile thing. And so one of the things you really don't want to do is break someone else's specimen. So I'm always super careful. I will practice how I'm going to support the specimen off the glass sheet. So it will be on a forgiving surface, usually my A4 pad of paper. And I will decide how I'm going to prop it. One of the laws of physics seems to be that minerals don't want to sit in the orientation that you want to photograph them. And so a bit of ingenuity is sometimes required. And so generally it'll be a combination of some sort of stand at the back, maybe some mineral tack, maybe a couple of corks. And I have a lot of corks and a Stanley knife with me, and I will custom make a support that will wedge in left and right to stabilize the specimen. And then once I'm happy that I've got a stable way of mounting it, I'll very gently move it onto the glass, remembering also that you've got to sweep off any dust and crumbs and look for fingerprints from the previous image that you've taken. Another specimen from the same neck of the woods. This was too big and heavy to risk putting onto my sheet of glass. Something I've always wondered I ought to do is load one of these sheets of glass up to destruction so that I do know. But I'm pretty confident you can put a house brick on it. But beyond that, if it's a Galena specimen the size of a house brick, I wouldn't risk it. And this is picture framing glass. It's about 2 millimeters thick. So this one therefore had to be shot on acrylic. And so this is my piece of opal perspex. You do get a shadow, but it's not an offensive shadow. It's quite soft, and so this very much emulates what Wendell Wilson used to produce for his standard min-ret photography. An alternative approach, and sometimes it's the approach of choice anyway, is to go for black background, and by doing that you can very much do whatever you want. Even if you had a support here holding this corner up, it's very easy to get rid of that in editing afterwards. All of my images, everything I've shown you, are real photographs. They're not lifted off and put onto a synthetic background. And so my photo editing, the furthest I would go is if I'd got a cork there, I will simply copy and wipe out the background, and that way you get an exact color match from the rest of the image. But that's a very pleasing specimen. I think that works very nicely. Here we've gone for blue, and I thought blue worked with this one because of the yellow of the chalcopyrite. I quite like that. Again, back to what we were saying at the beginning, it is a killer specimen. You can't really get light into these backgrounds here, but the important thing for me was to get some of the striations and the lighting on these big bismuthinite needles in the foreground, and to make sure that the rest of it is sharply in focus and uniformly illuminated. And so that works well. Here, black seemed to be the answer to me. This is a funny material to photograph. You can't get rid of the reflection everywhere because it's got this botryoidal sort of micro grape surface. But positioned, I don't know, probably took half a dozen shots of this. It's quite pleasing to have that bit of luster to say that actually I am shiny. I'm not like candle wax. So again, illumination and then total blackness sets off that yellow color of the chalcedony quite nicely. Specimens that are highly reflective are sometimes quite problematic, and it's really a question of getting the orientation right. And so this is a fairly large crystal of chalcosites, so 7 centimeters top to bottom. Again, a super expensive, valuable thing that you really don't want to chip. And this is sat on glass. And I have found that these things like galena and chalcosite and sphalerite and so on work quite well with this blue, blue fading out to black. And that seemed to be quite pleasing to me. Native copper, a rather unusual and quite heavy specimen. That's quite big. It's 11 centimeters tall. And that one definitely seemed to me to be calling out for black. And so these have all been shot using that same setup. So this is sat on the sheet of glass, black velvet underneath it, lit from about 45 degrees at the front. And again, here black worked most satisfactorily. I did try other colors. It doesn't matter that you can't see what it's sat on. You really want to bring out the translucency and the color of those fluorite crystals against the hematite staining. But something like this, which has obviously got depth and three-dimensionality to it, I think it's preferable that you actually use a graded background. And by having light at the front and dark at the back, you get that sense of depth. And one of the things that sometimes can be quite difficult is that if you have a specimen which is relatively small, it's quite hard to get a sharp enough gradation to get any sort of degree of, black to light. And this is true with this next one. I couldn't really get this much darker than that, but it's enough to give you some depth of field for this this horsetooth siderite. Very lustrous minerals can also be problematic, and so here the polarizing filter can be quite helpful. And I don't have a series of shots here, but you can imagine, I think, if I was to rotate the polarizer and change nothing else, this very bright face would go into extinction, if you like. This dull face would become brighter, that white reflection would disappear, that sparkly bit would disappear. But as you do that, a bit over here is going to then come into brightness and so on. So you just have to try and strike a realistic happy medium. And here, just here and there, you can see the body color of the cuprite coming through. Beautiful specimen in very nice condition. Things with very fine crystals. If you went in close, you could obviously resolve these, but inevitably you're going to get a degree of fuzziness and lack of sharpness. It doesn't matter because I know, and you know, that illibenite is a fibrous sort of silky type of material, and so that reflects what the specimen looks like. And this one, again, you could have gone for black, but I thought the graded background really brings out the depth of this. And so if I had shot it on black as well, I could have put the two together, you could make a choice. Here again, we've got very bright reflective chalcopyrite, and so it was quite important to tilt this to the optimum sort of angle. And because it's yellow or yellowish, I opted for blue as my preferred color, and I think that works reasonably well. One of the things that, as a mineral photographer, you need to think about is which way up should the specimen be. And there's no doubt in my mind that that is the right way up. And it does jar sometimes when you see a published photo and you think, well, it didn't grow like that, you know. And so if you've got an orientation issue that you can see clearly that this, the quartz would have grown on the top of this, and this grew on top of the sphalerite, it's a good idea to try and think about that when you actually photograph it. Translucency can be a bit of a challenge. I use a single flash gun, partly simply because that's how I started, and cost, but also it generally works most of the time. If you want to get more sophisticated and use a rig like Jeff Scoville was showing, you can now couple multiple flash guns together. You can have flash guns coming in from either side, behind, obliquely, from overhead. But generally it's not necessary. And so here I've simply played around until I got a result that seemed okay to me. Now I put this one in to say, well, sometimes instead of just having the specimen, you might want to provide some sort of context. And so this is a suite of rather amazing millerite crystals. The biggest of these is about 4 centimeters long. They're noticeably heavy to pick up. These are from Boltzburn mine up in County Durham. And they're in this rather beautiful Victorian box. And I thought it would be quite nice to have them in the box. But rather than shooting it in plan view from vertically overhead, which I think many people would do, I thought it was much more interesting to give it a bit of, again, three-dimensionality, move the lid off slightly to the side. You can see that it has a lid, and again, a sort of a fairly low profile background works well. One of the other things that minerals often have, and sometimes we want to exploit and sometimes we want to avoid, is a surface texture. So if you've got something that's very bright, like the pinacoid face on a beryl crystal, and you really want to show that you've got a mirror bright surface on the top, then the way that you light that will be quite specific. But in this shot, I think it works reasonably well. I wanted to show all these vicinal faces on this fluorite. So if you like, at the edge here, think of these as contour lines. The crystal is slightly bigger as we go along that line, and this is the apex. And I've counted them. There are more than 100 steps down that sequence there. And so I played around with the position of the specimen and the lighting just to pick up that. So this is quite deliberately lit as it is, and you can see some of the zoning as well. And this is an example of why sometimes black is best, because I couldn't make that float or stand in any satisfactory manner without having some supports. And so it's actually supported on a couple of little corks, which I've just painted out in editing afterwards, but it's shot on glass with a black velvet background. And it's just an amazingly distorted fluorite cube, very, very extended on one axis. Now here we've got a mixture of a very lustrous metallic mineral, galena, and something that is much less so and less reflective, calcite. And so it's a question of striking the balance, trying to make sure that we make the galena look lit, and the calcite is bright enough to be interesting. And so this, again, you can move the light, you can move the polarizer around until you get a reasonable amount of sort of dull specular reflection, if you like. I think these are quite acceptable to my eye. Very occasionally, I've used bright colours like dark purple or red, particularly where you're dealing with a sort of colourless or white mineral. In this case, a rather magnificent witherite from New Brunswick Colliery. And here I felt that it needed something to lift it up. And so I went for red. And then at the other end of the spectrum, sometimes something that's very pale and plain. And so here we're trying to get some light coming through the crystal, coming back up from the background. And so this is one of these strongly zoned fluorites from Rotherhope Fell. And again, there are dozens and dozens of color zones as you come down through that. Here, the thing to really bring out was the interesting surface texture on these pyramid faces of the calcite. And you can just see the profile. It's like ripples coming down the faces. There's obviously lots of shallow rhombs as you come down. But again, just a question of putting it in the right place and getting the angle right. One of those famous green fluorites from St. Peter's mine up in Northumberland, collected by Sir Arthur Russell. That worked definitely best on black rather than anything else. It really brings the colour out of the green and the yellow. Down in Devon, Virtuous Lady mine, these are very dull quartzes. They're very chalky white, and so that just meant playing around with the reflection. Because it's three-dimensional, I thought it warranted a graded background, and the contrast between the siderite and the quartz, the balance needed to be about right. Here's one of the famous boxes from the same locality. Here I wanted to try and make sure that I got darkness inside the cube, but I wanted to light the chalcopyrite and the quartz, and then we needed to get all the siderites right. So a grey was fine for that because there's enough colour and interest in the body of the specimen. This one, you've got a lot of reflection coming off this, and so it was a question of adjusting the slope, if you like, of this top face of the galena so that we didn't get the flash gun coming straight back. It needed a bit of depth, and so grey seemed to be a satisfactory result. And this one here, we've got this very dark sphalerite in the middle, which sort of mirrors the dark background of the graded black. We need to get the contrast in the white to show the texture of the barite, and so grey seemed to be a reasonable foreground colour for that. And a really remarkably good lanakite from the Robert Ferguson collection. This is now in Russell's collection at the NHM. And the sort of challenge here was to get enough light into these back holes, and all you can really do is get the angle pretty straight on, try and make sure that you're not getting too many specular reflections. There's one there. It is obviously possible, if you want to damp that down, you can go in, magnify that in your editing program and just paint it over to dull it. I do that occasionally, rarely, but generally speaking, I feel that scientific integrity, you really shouldn't fiddle. You shouldn't remove blemishes. You should shoot it as it is. And on that point, obviously, it does help if you've got a perfect calcite crystal like those. It really does to make a difference. Now this one, it was just impossible to get rid of all the specular reflections, but they don't detract from it. It actually says to you, hey, these are really shiny. And so enough of them are not reflecting to give you the colour and the body sense of the thing. And the fact that we've got a few here didn't offend my eye unduly. Now, sometimes we're going to shoot something that's sort of translucent to transparent, and I want to try and get some light through that. And so you may have to put an additional reflector in to try and get a bit of light bouncing around. Alternatively, you can just come in at a fairly steep angle or incline the specimen accordingly. And again, I think this was probably quite difficult to position, and so I did it on black because there will be some corks or stands here which I've edited out afterwards. Sometimes things just go your way. This sits just beautifully. It's about palm size as a specimen, and these things just sat in a beautiful orientation, and the lighting was bang on. No unwanted reflections, so happy bunny. Now, sometimes you're presented with something that really just isn't exciting. I mentioned black crystals at the back of black holes earlier on. A piece of transparent, translucent halite, which is colourless, just really doesn't make a great photo. I needed a photo of it to illustrate the story of Meadowbank Mine in Cheshire, and I thought on this occasion I'm going to shoot it with a reflection. And again, you may or may not like that, but it worked for me, and you can just play around with the intensity of that reflection if you want to. Now, many times you will look at a photo and you think, God, how did they get that to stand like that? Well, the answer is they didn't. This is not standing on that termination at the bottom. It's lying on its back, and you create the effect of it standing by the camera position and the lighting position. And once you appreciate that that's possible, then you can look at people's photographs and think, oh yeah, I understand how that was done. And so, don't spend lots of time trying to stand it on the tip. Not necessary. Now, this one was really put in to illustrate the fact that all of these phosgenite crystals, these pinacoid faces, are in optical continuity, and so they will wink in or wink out together on block. And I just wanted to try and get enough sheen to say these are super bright. And so I think you can see that this one's really catching it, and it's just slightly less so here. But you get the impression, I hope, that these are all in continuity and very, very perfect crystal faces. Also staying in the Midlands, this was a rather nice specimen to discover. This was in the Cedric Museum. So we've got a really blocky, this is about a 20mm phosgenite crystal, and then several rosettes of malachite on a fist-sized chunk of galena and barite matrix. And this one, again, this illustrates the color wheel aspect of the yellow of the malachite working well against the blue background, and that was fine. And I looked to me, I didn't want that one in again. That's why I've duplicated a couple here. Sorry about that. Right, again, this illustrates the fact that that is not standing like a ballerina on its toes. It has been positioned to look like it's standing on its end, and yeah, that illustrates quite nicely the difficulties of lighting something which is translucent and transparent and reflective and has got three-dimensionality. So we've got scattered reflections, but I think acceptable, and it doesn't need any help with the background. Grey works fine. And here we've got lots of texture, not a lot of colour, and so because it's quite a subtle colour, I think grey works quite well for that. And this is one of these unusual twisted sort of spiral barites from Dirtlow Rake. These things originally occurred in a carbonate mud, which you dissolved off and then see the structure. And if you were to saw that structure transversely, this is what you would see. And so these are color zone barite stalactites essentially, and you can see as you go outwards, it's starting to get its act together. The crystals are becoming coarser and purer and colorless. So in terms of where can you go for more information, there's now a vast resource of literature and online stuff. The links here, I think you should be able to capture those if you screenshot them. Obviously, I can't. You can't get a hyperlink off a Zoom image, but if you take a screenshot, you'll be able to capture those. And I've just put in a few. So Volker Betts is a real superstar, and he has got dozens of articles on Mindat. So if you go and find his homepage, Volker is his first name, German engineer, photographer par excellence. And there's lots of good, helpful, practical advice there in his articles. Mr. Gibbs here has a Mindat article on creating a variety of photo backgrounds. It tells you much of what I've mentioned earlier on. Dave Green produced a practical guide to combination photography. It's a good intro start. You can get that from the British Micromount Society website. Gem minerals are quite often a completely different kettle of fish. Firstly, they tend to be quite small. And so this is quite a useful article in Gems and Gemology. That's freely available. You can get that online in the 2015 edition. I mentioned Jeff Scoville's book. And then the Min Record, if you actually go to the homepage of the Min Record and go to the bit where notes of photographers, so if you were going to write an article for the Min Rec, they give some guidelines, much of which will repeat what you've heard from me. And there's also a little article by Wendell on what he calls advanced lighting techniques. So all of those I would suggest as good places to go if you'd like to learn more. I hope Shanice will forgive me saying that you can also, if you like those pictures, have a look at my website and have a look at these. All of the images in those two books were taken by me using the kit that you've just been looking at. And there's well over 1,000 images of nice British minerals between the two titles.